Hey guys, here with my good friend Dan, and he is a pastor at Neighbors Church down in San Diego, and has been a part of Light Church really since the beginning through conversation and prayer. And him and Alexis, his wife, came up and taught a whole conference on the Enneagram and how understanding our unique wiring can help us connect with God. And so during this time, as I personally have just been thinking through what does it look like to abide in Christ, immediately my mind goes to my wiring and and part of that has been helpful for me is the Enneagram and understanding how those certain things. And so Dan, knowing this material way better than me, just wanted to get on Zoom and just have a conversation with you about what does it look like to abide in Christ and to remain in Him based on our unique wirings. And then maybe before we dive right into that, can you give us just a brief overview? If someone's like, I don't know what the Enneagram is, or where do I take a test or get information on that? Can you give us just like a short summary on that?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me. Love you so much, Benji. Love you, Light Church. You guys are amazing. Enneagram. So the Enneagram that you've probably been exposed to is what we're calling the Enneagram of personality. And it's a system of somewhat like the Myers-Briggs meets Strength Finders meets deep spiritual discernment meets deep historical tradition. It's about 50 years old in the form that you've been exposed to, but it's actually a longstanding oral tradition that spans across multiple spiritual schools of thought, both Eastern and Western, primarily brought to the evangelical community through the Jesuits. And as we have it in its form today, it's a somewhat kind of popularized way of understanding the way that we develop patterns of behavior and the way that we interpret the world coming at us and the way that we live into the world externally. What Enneagram gives us is tools for where those patterns are deformed or out of shape. And my wife and I, we come at it from the perspective of St. Paul, and we use the language of in the flesh. Paul would say when we're in the flesh, when we're in that old part of us, that false part of us, the false self, we fabricate, we mask, we strive, we sin. But because we're born again, because we're filled with the Holy Spirit, there's a 2 Corinthians 5:17, a new creation. And that new creation is actually a return to our essence, to what we were and what we are to be, our true selves. And the fruits of the Spirit are what? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. Those things are all manifest in the Enneagram 9 types around the circle. And Enneagram gives us tools to discern where patterns are in the flesh and how we can rest and return to receive from the Holy Spirit our true self. So that's a 3-minute introduction to, 1,000-year-old tradition. So there you have it. Yeah, I'm following very closely here in this topic, the insight and teaching of a guy named Chris Horowitz. So if you want the details on everything I'm going to talk about right now, Horowitz in his book, Sacred Enneagram, is a great introduction to what I'm talking about. I think rather than jumping right into the types, it's first important to note that each of us are going to be inclined by our typing to interpret and understand and experience abiding in particular ways. And I think what's most important for us is defining what Jesus meant by abiding. And it is, abiding is experiencing and knowing union with the Trinitarian God and his love. It is to rest in and live out of, in the present moment, the Trinitarian God's reality and our union with him and with each other. That's what abiding is. So that's a big idea. And each of us miss out on abiding because of our wiring and our typing. and the way that we try to construct a sense of abiding or a sense of security or a sense of love. So if we know what we're going for, it's helpful to know that we're trying to diminish our lingering on the past, which doesn't exist anymore. It's already gone. And we're trying to mitigate against our worry about the future, which doesn't exist yet, and be in the present moment in Christ, where we are, living out of the true spirit of who we are. So Benji, do you want me to just jump right in and walk through the 9 types, or do you want to explore anything else further? How do you want to go about it? Let's start with the triads. We'll do that briefly. The Enneagram 9 types break into 3 triads, and ways that we interpret the world, or what we call our intelligence center. So it's gut, body, heart, emotion, head, mind, starting with 8, 9, 1, gut, body, 2, 3s, 4s, heart, emotion, 5, 6, 7s, heads and minds. And the gut body people, the 8, 9, 1s, they're going to tend to abide in their activity. We're doers. 1s want to make everything right. 9s want to keep everything at peace. 8s just want to control everything. And so the way we live into the world and what we abide in, where we find our security and joy in the gut triad, is by always doing. So this is important, because what Horowitz would say is the doers need to consent to not doing. Okay. And I'll give more of that here in just a moment. So the heart emotion people, the 2s, 3s, and 4s, they live in this identity. They create their identity in what others think about them. And so they tend to abide in the opinion of humans around them. So 2s are always trying to serve others so that they can get love. 3s are always trying to impress others so that they can feel significant. And 4s are trying to always persuade others that they're wholly unique for the sake of their significance. And so they have to learn how to abide in solitude, being away from people. And then you have the head people, the head mind people, 5, 6, 7s in the head triad, and their core reality is a fear of insecurity. Fear is what drives them. And so they tend to attach themselves to what they have, not just material goods, but like 5s attach themselves to their answers. And so what they have to do is recognize that they abide, or they rest themselves in what they own, how many plans they can come up with, how many experiences they can have if you're a 7. And instead, learning to abide in a place of silence and just calming the mind and calming the planning. Okay. So when we talk about abiding, we're going to just talk about some of the spiritual practices of the contemplatives that are the most helpful. And it's really broken down into 3 primary practices, physical practices: silence, not talking; solitude, literally being alone; and stillness, not moving. And then what Horowitz does is he talks about how each of these types needs to engage with one of these practices, because it's going to be the most revealing to where they're living falsely out of their false self and live more fully into their true self by these practices exposing that. Any questions? Did all that make some sense?
No, it does. And for each of the triads, um, that what you described, will that be maybe the hardest practice for them to live into?
Yeah.
So you can kind of identify the one that's just like hardest for you to do, and that's like your cue.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's helpful. That's a good way of thinking of it. You have to remember, in the Enneagram tradition, there's just no fluff in it. When you really begin to have the Enneagram peel away the layers of false self, it's disorienting and it's humiliating. And the way the Enneagram works is it exposes shadow, from which we've been living in a shadow that we felt safe in. And so the practices that are most helpful are actually like flashlights or spotlights that come in and light up the shadow that we've been living in or living out of. And the broken part of us, the flesh part of us, wants to maintain that shadow. And so if you find yourself irritated by one of these practices, or I flat out cannot do that, that's too terrifying to me, or I don't know what I would do if I actually did that,
Wow.
that's probably going to be a space that the Holy Spirit is gently, God is always gentle with us, Benji. He's gently inviting you to allow light to begin to flood into these spaces. And you have to root yourself in that abiding sense. Jesus said, abide in my, not in my correction of you, not in my judgment of you. You're learning to abide in love.
Mm.
You abide in unconditional love as you are, wherever you are in your self-awareness journey and whatever mistakes you've made. So you front end this with love and acceptance and a concern for your flourishing. That's what God is doing in this. And then that gives you courage to walk into these practices.
So good. Let's start with us, because you're an 8, correct? And I'm a 9. So let's maybe kind of start at the top here. And let's just tell on ourselves. I mean, kind of walk us through, what does that look like for us to step into that place that may feel uncomfortable, but what can happen if we do that?
Yeah. 8s have been described as volcanoes held down by paper napkins. So I resonate with that. The paper napkin does not do much good. 8s on the Enneagram spectrum, 8s and 4s probably have the largest energies. In different ways, they manifest those ways of being differently, but it's a huge energy in the room. So for the 8 has built, she has built her identity around a facade of invulnerability. 8s are always doing and moving. 8s have an insatiable need for power. I know that sounds so evil in our authority adverse culture, but 8s don't want power to control others. 8s just don't want to be controlled by somebody. Okay. So 8s are always needing to be in control of their situation or in control of their environment. And they do that through a bigness and through a doing, through an intensity. So where that is deformed, Horowitz would say that for the 8, they need to, in some ways, almost wave the white flag to God. And he says the 8's most important contemplative practice is to consent to stillness. And so for myself, it's literal stillness. I'm the type of person that wakes up at 6 a.m. and goes till well after sundown with, and it feels like an endless amount of energy. And it's just, I have to be moving.
Mm.
And so my practice is, and I've developed it over years now, and I continue to develop it, is to literally sit in the practice of stillness for sometimes great lengths of time. I'll set a timer and I'll note my breath, and I consent to being still, that I don't need to do. I consent by faith to not needing to control. I consent to the volcano that is Dan, whether it's the rage that's left over and anger, or whether it's the anxiety, or it's the power structure stuff that I'm always working through in my soul. I consent that it's there and that I don't need to do anything about it. God is doing something about it in that time. And so it's initially terrifying and terribly difficult, but over time, this is where I have found, without question, some of the deepest soul healing for myself to live as a healthy 8.
Wow.
Remember, when volcanoes blow up, they can either destroy stuff or they can create more land for people to play on. And that's what we're supposed to do.
True. Volcanoes can create some very beautiful things.
Yeah. The 9s are interesting. 9s are the most unaware of their body. So the centerpieces of all the triads, 9s, 3s, and 6s, they are the anchor points, but ironically, they're also the most removed from their intelligence center. So you live into the world through your body, but you most of the time are numbed out to your body, not aware of what's going on in it. And so for the 9, there needs to be an intentional engagement, is the word, in stillness. So because you're a body type, you still need to be still. But for you, when I say stillness, it's something totally different, Benji. My wife is a 9. She has to engage stillness by going for a walk. So she'll go out for a walk and she'll just engage with what her body is doing and feeling like. She'll engage with the emotions that she's experiencing. She will engage with an intentional, not numbing or resigning herself to what is, but she will engage with, in her walk, letting God create stillness that's true, because she doesn't have to keep peace in the midst of everything while she's on her walk. She's still in that. But the posture is different. Whereas my posture and intention is consent, I'm like surrendering and not moving. She has to engage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I know for me, it's interesting because when I spend time with the Lord each morning, I wake up before everyone else. It is preceded by a lot of movement. Like I have to like get ready, take a shower, make my coffee, clean up the living room, make my kind of space of like
Yep.
peace and things like that. It takes so much effort to get there. And then normally by the time I get there, it's been like an hour of prep work. And then I'm like, and then my kid wakes up, like it's just, but when I go, interestingly enough, you say that when I go on a run,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I can't clean up the dirt around me or the ocean next to me. That honestly has almost been the most aware I am of
Yeah.
God's presence is almost when I leave
Yep.
and I'm aware. So that's an interesting insight for sure. And I resonate with that.
Yeah, and it's your intention when you go out is not, you're not surrendered and you're not passive, but you're actively engaging with a stillness between you and God. And you're engaging with whatever is, whatever you want to numb out or ignore or try to bring peace to, you engage with that stillness as you're moving. And so a lot of these practices, they may be physical in reality, like for me as an 8, being still, but they're actually, what they do is they create a posture in which you live into your environment as you're moving, as you're doing, as you're working.
Super good. Super good. So what does that look like for a 1?
Okay, yeah. So the 1s are the final piece. I still find 1s so enigmatic. They seem to be so in their heads, but they are body people. They're dealing with a lot of resentment and anger. They live in a space of idealism and frustration, rooted around some of the triads that they live out of. In other words, 1s look at the world and they say, I can see an ideal moral world, a world that is right in myself internally and externally, and it's all wrong. And so they are eternally frustrated with the world that they live in. 1s are, and they feel it in their bodies, and it usually manifests as bitterness and anger. Really unhealthy 1s get horrifically cynical and sometimes cruel in the way that they interpret and handle things in this life. And so for the 1s, they need to learn to rest in stillness, because they're body types. They still need to be still, but they need to learn how to let their body rest with what is. Rest, let the inner critic that's telling them where they're wrong and what's wrong with them and why they can't get, just, it's almost like putting in earplugs for a 1 and becoming still with the imperfections, knowing that God, the Holy Spirit, is perfecting. And the posture or the intention of that 1 is to rest. The 8, I surrender. I concede. The 9, I engage. I'm active. The 1, she's coming into a place of relaxing and also learning to rest with what's out there in the world, that God knows better what's out there in the world, and that though they can see this ideal world, learning how to rest in it versus continually being frustrated by it.
Super good. And I bet really hard.
Yeah, I think of my daughter's a 1 and my heart goes out to 1s. They are some of the most incredible humans on the planet, but boy, they, of all of us, they deal with this inner critic. We're all critical of ourselves in some measure, but the 1s are just relentless. And I think the 1s, they operate in a constant state of low-grade fatigue, if not full soul exhaustion. And the practice that they have to engage with is learning to just be still restfully still, resting in a stillness where they don't have to fix themselves or anybody else. And that is a deep abiding work that Christ does through love, recognizing that it is not their doing that makes the world right or themselves right, but what Jesus has done in them, for them, through them, by his life, death, and resurrection. And that requires rest and stillness to meditate on that.
Wow. So good. Um, what does it look? I'm very curious about this one. What does it look like for a 2 to abide?
So as we move into the 2s, 3s, and 4s, we're looking now at the heart triad, and we're looking at a community of people that are so relational. Their identity is so contingent upon the relationships around them. And of 2s, everybody loves to have a 2 around, because the 2 is going to pick up. The 2 would prepare. Benji, if you had a 2 in your house, they would do the living room for you before you got there, brother. But the problem is they deform that and they twist that, and they can become 2s of all the types can become so manipulative. They have this running list of I did this, and I'm waiting for you to do this back for me. And if you don't, I'm gonna lose it and become full 8 on you at some point.
Wow.
And so they, like the 8s, have to consent to something, but they have to consent to solitude. Because when a 2 goes into a place where there's nobody to please and nobody to serve, then they have to surrender to the fact that God is pleased with them apart from their serving and apart from their doing. And it's a surrendered act of the 2. The 2 is literally saying, okay, in solitude, I am learning to surrender to the fact that I am loved wholly and unconditionally, and I am doing nothing for anyone. And the initial stages of solitude for a 2 literally feel like death, because they have nobody to serve. They have nobody to affirm them. They have nobody to say, well done, I love you so much for doing this for me. They're just there in the solitude, consenting to the reality that God has done everything for them so that they can serve freely and unconditionally.
Wow. Man, so good. So good.
Yeah. And I think that the solitude piece, like the stillness piece, becomes a posture of heart. 2s do literally physically need to move into places of solitude. Retreats are super important for heart triad people, where they're alone, no people, backpacking, camping, things like that. But they need to engage and consent to solitude often enough that they can carry that posture of solitude into their community, where they are not lonely in their community, but they are in solitude in themselves with God for the sake of their community, so that they're serving out of that consented, abiding, solitary place with God. And that when you meet healthy 2s that are living in that space, oh man, the John 13 foot washing Jesus just gushes out of them. And they're very moving and powerful creatures.
So awesome. What does it look like for the achiever, for the type 3 to abide?
Again, the 3s, they're a centerpiece of the heart triad, just as the 9s are of the gut triad, which means that 3s think that they're more in their heads, but they are operating out of their emotions and out of their centerpiece heart. They're just detached from it. They're just removed from it. I haven't quite gotten my head around why that is with those centerpiece types, but it proves true almost every time. It's eerily true. And so the 3 learned that their value, or they discerned somehow as they interpreted the world around them, that their value was based on what other people thought of them, namely their significance. Their value is built around the applause of others. So 3s learn to adapt to every situation and succeed in it for the sake of applause or for the sake of affirmation. 3s are sometimes called the chameleons of the Enneagram archetypal patterns, because they learn how to camouflage who they really are so that they can receive what they think the others want them to be, so they can be applauded and have a sense of love. And because of that, they need to actually engage with solitude. 3s need to actively go away from people where they can, for the first time, realize that the construct of significance that they have built their lives on is really just a vapor. It's just a fog. When threes are engaged in a place of solitude and all they have is themselves, they are liberated. They are liberated from any opportunity to build identity on what others are. They're just sitting there. Let's say they're just sitting there on a bench watching the waves, you know, out at Swami's or whatever. They're just being. And slowly but surely, the mystery of God's Holy Spirit working in that engagement with solitude, the active engagement with solitude for the three, begins to liberate them from that false sense of value. And they begin to realize God can achieve through me when I am engaged with him. And I can go back into my community and with the gifts. I mean, threes are powerful leaders, wise strategists, and they're doers. They are get stuff done.
Right.
But when they engage with solitude, they are released from that unhealthy and deforming need. And it creates in them a patience and really an endurance to do what God is calling them to do and achieve in the world. That comes through this engagement with solitude, with not being around people for, and I would say of all the types, threes need to engage with solitude for longer durations of time. I think because our society, our Instagram society, is a threes addictive nightmare. Like threes are just surrounded by a society that builds their identity on Instagram followers, right? And so of all of them, they need to be able to escape the cacophony around us of you are significant because of what people say about you. And it takes longer time. And I think that's a sub point that I'd make to all the types as you're listening to this. Be gentle with yourself and give yourself lots and lots and lots of time. It's taken a lifetime to get us where we are, as messed up as we are. And God, the Holy Spirit, wants to take a lifetime in eternity to bring us into fullness. And so,
yeah.
And as a three, you're going to want to be like, I'm engaging with solitude. I'm going to nail this. Well, you need to go be alone and think about why you got to nail it.
Best nailer ever.
I'm going to kill solitude, man.
Oh, so good. Some of my best friends are threes.
Me too, dude. Me too.
Very cool. And how about the fours? Jen's a four. And the thought of her being in solitude already, I'm just like, oh man, shit, that would be hard for her. She's a very people-oriented four. I know it's not always the case, but even if she's alone, she wants to have a friend with her or her family with her, and that's her version of where she's
extroverted fours and introverted fours. Either way, fours around the circle of the Enneagram, there are feelers, man. And because they're relationally heart-inclined human, solitude is just initially going to be agony. And at the core of that is a fear of loss of uniqueness. For every four that I know, whether it's your wife or the fours that I know really in depth, they are thinkers and they are feelers, and they force the rest of humanity to say what is real, what really matters. But when you're alone, nobody's listening. And for the four, that sense of uniqueness, you have to be unique in contrast or in comparison to other humans around you. And you have to feel depth in comparison to the shallowness that's around you. And fours will, in a deformed way, begin to build their identity on, I'm the deep one here and everybody else is shallow. But when you're alone, you're just there with God, who feels not only the depths of you, but the depths of all human emotion, and feels the depths of all agony, and feels the depths of all joy, and is the holy soul unique mover and moved you into existence. And that is a terrifying for a four. It's a terrifying moment because now what they've known and based themselves on is beginning to fall apart. As Jesus said, they're losing themselves. But after that death is the finding of true self. Balanced fours, they learn to rest in solitude. And so rather than anxiously making sure that they're feeling everything in solitude, fours oftentimes don't even know that they can't handle the tsunami of their emotion. They know that they've hurt other people or overwhelmed other people with the tsunami of their emotion, but they've never come to grips with the fact that their own tsunami of emotion is overwhelming their own souls. So fours need to learn to rest, that there is a surrendered aspect for the four going into solitude, especially at the beginning, and learning how to, almost like a Barco lounger, sit back and say, okay, my Father created me unique, and I'm going to rest in the tsunami that is my emotional makeup. And I'm going to just be with it in a restful state, because I know that Jesus endured and Jesus experienced and Jesus has, even now, the breadth of emotion and sense and depth that I have. And he wants me to abide. He wants me to be in union with him, so that there's an emotional, spiritual maturity for the four that comes out of solitude. And then the four can carry that wisdom and that, just that breadth. When you get around a healthy four, you are forced to face it, but you feel loved in it. You feel safe in it. You don't feel like guilty because you don't feel like they feel, right? And that's what solitude, resting in solitude, does for the fours. It gives them that space to know their own emotional construct in the presence of Jesus, as he just cares for them through that and walks them through that.
When they have those moments of resting in their own emotional makeup, uh, does, like, kind of in your study or your experience, does that settle their emotions, like almost like kind of temper it, or does it just validate it, like, oh, Jesus can meet you in your emotional side, he can feel as deeply as you can? Do they almost come to peace, like, it's okay that I have all of these emotions, this is okay that God has wired me this way?
Yeah, I think it's the latter piece. I have a metaphor that their emotional depth has not, that their emotional depth has been like subdued. In fact, if they are, they're probably repressing, and they're probably pressing down something that is going to end up blowing up somewhere at some point. I think the way you articulated it is good, though. In solitude, they learn to accept. Acceptance is a key piece of resting. They learn to accept that they feel, and they also learn to rest in the fact that many people just cannot handle feeling what they feel. They don't want to. And so now it's no longer a striving to demand that their unique way of being in the world is the right way. It's gifting it to the world as an invitation to come and feel, to whatever degree other people need to feel it. And in solitude, I would say as well, the four is allowed to even expand those feelings with a God who can handle it.
Yeah.
Four is able to, fours should be journaling. I would really encourage fours in their times of solitude to just do like a brain dump or an emotional dump and just write whatever word and sentence and thought comes, and write it till you're just empty, and then offer that to God, who says, oh, yeah, I understand.
Really?
I'm with you. Yeah. It just gives counterpoint and balance for fours, where they can return to their community and be servants with their breadth and depth of energy and emotion, and gift it to other people like shepherds would, versus unhealthy forests just tend to cram it, and then demand it, because that's the structure of their identity. But that self has to be lost for the true essence to come forth.
So good, so good. Well, talk to me about 5, 6, and 7. These are some really precious people in my life are these, but it's been more mysterious for me, um, these types. So talk to me about what abiding looks like, for these 3 types.
Yeah. So the 5, 6, and 7s, we move into the head triad. Some of their core issues that they're working through is a dynamic fear. It's almost an unceasing fear of, for the 5, that they will be imposed upon, for the 6 of the future that's going to collapse on them. The sky is always falling, Chicken Little situation. For the 7, that they're going to be trapped, and not have opportunity for excitement, or that they're going to be trapped in any sort of pain at all. So there's fear, but the way that they interpret that and the way that they strategize to get out of that is in their heads. That's their primary place that they're always working. And so starting with the 5, the 5 needs to, like the 8 and like the 2, the 5 needs to consent. And what the 5 needs to consent to is silence. So not just silence of words. 5s are oftentimes introverted, Fives don't say a lot in our social settings. Fives you would never think are the most loud or they need to stop talking. But what fives have is this constant, relentless question and answer session going on in their heads. And they are relentlessly pursuing answers. And they're always talking about why that answer may not be right. So they need to get more answers and more research and more data. It is a constant inflow. And so if you could get into the head of a five, it's very noisy. Even though their demeanor on the outside is protected. They're in what they call the castle of the mind of the five. They're in their own little castle in there, and it's very loud, and they're always filling it. And so they have to consent that they don't have all the answers. I concede now, my Father, I don't have the answers, you do. And they concede to allowing their mind to become silent. For just 5 minutes, I'm not going to seek answers. I'm going to concede and consent to the silence of God having the answers, of God being enough, of God knowing, and that if I don't know, God will supply what I do need to know. And that's a real battle for the fives, because the minute that they're not taking in data, it feels like a loss of themselves, and it feels like a loss of security. And it's a removal of all of those false fig leaf identity markers. But the more that they're able to do that, then they're able to take in information, and they're able to take in answers, and they're able to, I don't know, amalgamate it or bring it together in such a way that they can bring it back into their communities. And rather than their castle being closed off and guarded, now when they begin to share, they're there to share out of a place of consent. I've been silent, and now I'll give you what answers I have. And I think it'll be helpful to me, and it'll be helpful to you. But at the end of the day, we're going to be silent before God, who does have all the answers. And that is a profound moment for a five to experience, a sense of consent and release to needing all the answers. It also frees them up from the paralysis that they often fall into, where they're not doing anything because they don't feel like they have enough data. They're able to leap a little bit more, and they're able to generate and lean into a little more of that sevenness that we all have, just having some good times, you know? With the sixes, they have to engage with silence. So if the fives are consenting that I'm not going to have all the answers, the sixes have to engage with an intentional practice that takes them into a place where they let the plans about the future falling apart and how they're going to have plan A, plan B, plan C to keep the future from falling apart on them. They engage with the practice of right now, in this present moment, nothing's falling apart. Nothing. I'm going to engage with this moment, and I'm going to let the plans fall quiet. And in the silence, what rises out of that for the six is indeed their essence of courage, that they do have the ability to handle life. And if, and it will, but if and when life throws them a curveball, well, out of silence that they've engaged with, they won't react with the need to run to authority or run to a system. They'll have enough faith in who God has made them that they can partner with authority and partner with systems and the various ways that they find strength. They can partner, but differentiated from it, and out of a place of real courage and real sincere lived life in the present moment. Of all the types, the sixes are so future oriented and so living out there in what doesn't exist yet. And so this engagement with silence brings them into a present space and a present moment with their God as they abide in him.
So good. So
Yeah.
good. And the beloved sevens, what does abiding look like for them?
I don't know, man. Sometimes I don't want to see sevens get fixed. They're so much fun when they're unhealthy. They just want to, I mean, all hell could be breaking loose, and sevens are like, hey, this is why it's a party, man. Let's just honestly, unhealthy sevens, you know one when you've been around one for very long, because you reach a point where you're like, dude, this is not good. And you can't sweep this under the carpet, and you can't ignore this forever. And so with sevens, the seven is always trying to escape any sense of entrapment. The seven is they only know one side of the human spectrum of emotion when they're unhealthy, which is joy and adventure and excitement.
Mm.
And they view the other half of broken humanity, which is depression and sadness and angst and discouragement, as a prison. And so rather than that being part and parcel of the human experience, they are always planning in their heads. And that's why sevens have a hard time sticking to something, because it feels like they're getting trapped in something. So they have to escape to the next one. If you've ever been around a seven, man, they've got 800 ideas, none of which are going to get to fulfillment. It's just something to talk about and go after for a couple minutes till you move on to the next thing. And so for sevens, because they are in their heads, they have to rest. Their intention or their posture is to rest in silence, meaning the next adventure that they're running for, the next big plan that they're going to unfold, the next exciting thing that they're going to eat or do or invite people to, the next moment of laughter, they have to learn how to rest in just being silent. And that is where the seven begins to get in touch with those inner moments of the other half of their emotion, which they have there. And as they do, the essence of seven is wisdom. They counterbalance. The joy is counterbalanced by an ability to interact with their own emotional sadness and their own sense of entrapment. And it works like almost like a seesaw counterbalancing effect, where the human that is a seven comes back from their time of resting in silence, not planning. And then they can look at the others and they can give to others. Here's a way where we can reframe this around a picture of joy. But it's not just, let's go to Disneyland and have a party because there's a funeral tomorrow that I don't want to think about. It's, there's a joy in the midst of the pain that we all have to face. That can only come from a rested place of silencing the plans to get away from it. For sevens, it's so important that they learn how to feel grief and learn how to grieve and rest in it. That lament, reading Psalms of lament, and then meditating in a silent place of the brokenness around them. It's okay to feel that and not have to prop it up and band-aid it with fun experiences or more plans. So there's a resting in silence that creates a wisdom for sevens that is very, very powerful the more healthy they get.
Wow. So good, Dan. I'm already feel so encouraged just hearing all these things, thinking about the people in my life who identify with these different types. And would you do me a favor? Would you just kind of in conclusion, would you just kind of remind us of what you were saying just a while back of just the grace and the patience that this requires? This isn't just like, oh, cool, I learned how to abide, and so I'm good at it now. Like, how should we pace ourselves in the practice of abiding?
Yeah. This is not 100-meter dash, and this is not high-speed internet. This is not fast food. The contemplatives spent decades in their cells and in their monasteries thinking and writing and meditating and praying. And you really do need to recognize that God apparently took thousands, if not millions, if not billions of years to bring about this thing called human experience, okay? He's just not in a rush. And so in the short 20, 30, 40 years, wherever you're at in your life journey right now, that 40 years piled up all these things. And so the Lord is just so kind and so gentle with us in that he doesn't do anything in a rushed way. And he does things perfectly in his time. And you have to really deafen your ears to a society that is built on speed and frenetic, like a frenetic pace, and aggression. Our society is so aggressive. And so again, I think America is just a society of three, so accomplishment oriented and doing oriented. And so just know that even a month or two into this, you're going to be frustrated and you're going to feel like you're not making any progress. You're going to feel like the practice that you've been commissioned to is even more irritating. The contemplatives would say, now you're onto something. Now you're getting there. So I've really been meditating a lot lately. Saint Ignatius in his spiritual exercises or somewhere in one of his writings, he essentially talked about when you begin to see the tiny little sprout of what will become a fruit tree, we tend to just run off from it in our society. Like we're just too fast. We don't even notice that the sprout is beginning to come up. But instead he said, stop there. If you notice in your time of, for like me, consenting to stillness, that there is a place of rage right here, and it's been there since you were like 4. No need to run off to that and get it fixed. Tend to that little sprout of a fruit-bearing tree that's coming out of your innermost being. Tend to it, return to it, water it. Benji, I'm at a place now in my life. You talked about the word that abide is like kind of your word right now.
Yeah.
I choose a word every year. And this year, I one word that I meditate on for a year. And this year, my word is receive. Receive what is, consent to stillness in the midst of it, so that I can, being the volcano I am, create land and safety for people to live in it on. In my Bible reading, I've read through the Bible. I can't even count how many times I've read through the Bible now. Now I'm like, if I find a moment of a verse that leaps off the page, I'll stay with it for 3 weeks. And I think that this slowed down thing is the only way that any of us in our typing and in our deformed and shadow behaviors are going to first begin to discern what's happening in the moment. We're like on autopilot, but then give time to God, who moves tectonic plates, like the tectonic plates. He moves them like a centimeter a year or something. Think of your soul like tectonic plates, and God's just, he's big and strong, and he is moving it. It's just you waiting and letting him do it in his time. And that's a big piece of consent and rest and engagement. These intentions is recognizing the God that we are interacting with and consenting and engaging and resting in that. With the key word being gentle. He's not going to earthquake us. He crucified his son and raised him from the dead. His hands are pierced, and he touches us with the most gentle and precise surgeon's work in our soul. So just don't try to rush it, and don't try to speed it up. Let him have you completely. This is what union is.
Gosh, so good, man. So rich. Feels honestly very encouraged by this. And thanks for taking your time, not only in this Zoom call, but just with your life. And we were just talking about even you finishing up your MDiv like this week, and you just taking very slow to do that, and the fruit of that is evident. Man, thank you so much for sharing this information, and more importantly, just sharing your heart. And if you're watching this and you live by San Diego State and are looking for a church, Dan and Alexis are phenomenal shepherds and have birthed a really beautiful community, even in the midst of all that's going on, called Neighbors. And I'd highly encourage you to look that up. But Dan, love you, man. Thanks.
Yeah, I love you too, Benji. Thanks for having me, man. It's an honor.
Can't wait to surf again.
Yes, dude. I'm buying a board for my graduation gift. So yeah.
Good for you. Awesome. All right, dude. I'll talk to you soon.
See ya.
Bye.